My name's Dan Young. I work at EngineerBetter. We are a UK Cloud Foundry consultancy. We work with lots of companies that are using Cloud Foundry, and we also work with Pivotal, which is why I'm here already. I didn't have to sort of come here from somewhere else. We're working with some customers who have inspired this talk, and I've been thinking a bit about what BOSH means to big enterprises and why they would use it. So what I'm going to try and do is give a beginner's talk, but from a business point of view, not from a technical point of view. So I am going to point you to places where you can find out about using BOSH in the same way you just have with CF. There's some great tutorials out there, and I'll tell you where to go. But this is more from the business point of view. Now, what I'm going to do is look at like the last 10 years of cloud adoption, so public cloud adoption, and what's been happening. And then we're going to look at what's happening now, so some of the trends that are happening in the marketplace, some of the evidence that suggests that things are changing in the way that buyers are perceiving the different public cloud options. And then we're going to look at BOSH itself and Cloud Foundry as a whole and that whole technology ecosystem. And you'll hopefully begin to see that when you're in possession of that stuff and the Cloud Foundry Foundation that sits around it, you can start to make much better decisions about your technology choices when you're developing software products. But before we do all that, I'm going to tell a little story. So I'm not the only Dan at EngineerBetter. There's two of them, and my colleague, some of you will know, is Dan Jones. Now, he has quite a distinctive mustache. He wasn't born with that mustache. It is on his face, and it remains there by virtue of the fact that he makes certain decisions in his life about what he's going to do. And he gets up every day, and he looks in the mirror, and he decides, am I going to keep the mustache? And he goes, yes, I'm going to keep it. And he goes away, and he comes back later, and he thinks about it again, and he decides again he's going to keep it. But every time he goes around that decision cycle, it gets harder and harder to get rid of the mustache, because all these things in his life depend on it. His family's expectations, the ability of his friends and his co-workers to recognize him, the marketing face of his business, are all at risk if he gets rid of the mustache. So you could say his switching costs away from having the mustache are very high. It's very difficult for him to move away to being clean shaven. So we often have this kind of sense of dread in business when we make certain choices and we have to live with them in future. And some of us in this room will have lived through a couple of decades of this with Microsoft and Oracle and VMware. And it starts to feel very uncomfortable, and we feel ourselves going down a particular decision cycle again and again and again. And we sort of call this Lockin. Now, I was interested in Lockin as a concept, so I went away and read about what people had said about Lockin. And it turned out that it's a cycle. So it's not a binary state. It's a cycle that progressively escalates your switching costs in business, in technology choices. So you go along to make a decision, and you choose a brand or a vendor, and then you begin trying that technology, and as time goes on, you become more and more entrenched in that decision, and you come around again to make another technology choice, and the world looks different to how it did before, because you are in a situation where you've got this pre-existing investment, and it seems like it would make more sense to just maybe do the same thing again, because you've got these dependencies in your life. So if you understand things to be a cycle, and then you apply that to the last 10 years of cloud, and public cloud decision and buying decisions, what you find is that Amazon have been incredibly good at playing this game from a supplier point of view, and everyone else on the buying side has been really, really bad at understanding that they're in this cycle and they need to manage it appropriately. So you've had a one-horse race, they've been miles ahead of everyone else, they've got this incredibly compelling set of economics for the business and a very compelling velocity in their release of features, and you've historically had very, very poor set of switching tools to enable you to move between different vendors. And there hasn't really been anyone to switch to because you've kind of been in this one-horse race scenario. So it's been quite a challenging time if you wanted to manage your lock-in costs. Who cares? So what? Amazon is brilliant. It does work most of the time, and they run a great service. So what's the problem with this? Well, we're notoriously bad as a society at planning for what are called black swan events. So these unexpected things that happen in our lives, in our businesses, and the world around us. That, and because they're unexpected, we kind of pretend that they don't happen. And the world is full of these things happening all the time. So we're in a situation now where, and this raises an interesting question. So can you think of another utility service that runs at a global scale, because cloud computing is a utility service, it's a computing utility. Is there anything else that exists that you use, like gas and water and electricity, where a serious impact to that utility service would impact the entire globe, like all of the users globally? Everything you use in other utility services is regionally bounded. So you're in a situation where you have these black swan events, and we know from the banking crisis and Brexit and the Trump phenomenon that unexpected things happen in this world that we cannot understand, and there is no single entity or institution on earth that is immune from this stuff. Right? If you've got one name, you are a single point of failure. There are economic events and political events that we do not foresee happening. Because the world is complex, so you, by definition, in complex systems, you don't have a predictable link between cause and effect. That's what defines complex systems. So you've got these unexpected events, and we don't really think about them in advance. But what happens is that as we go around this decision cycle for 10 years, everybody's doing the same thing. So you get on the train of making the decisions of buying Amazon stuff, and then you look at what's been happening, and everyone else has been doing the same thing. So the competitive advantage that you were seeking in the beginning from using Amazon has actually eroded because the skills are diffused across the industry, and it's easier to access this stuff. So really, your competitive advantage is starting to erode. Another trend that has been happening since we started using computers is that we like abstracting stuff. So Barbara Liskov, who was the first American woman to get a PhD in computer science, made this observation. So modularity through abstraction is the way things get done. And what this is a very good observation because it shows just how much humans like having these composable abstractions in computing. So Barbara Liskov her work led to the development of object-oriented programming. But obviously, abstraction hasn't stopped there. So we have abstractions which are built on top of virtualization, and then we have cloud, and then we have these cloud silos and these different vendors. But why would we stop at that if we have the ability to abstract even beyond that and have composable abstractions from these cloud vendors and use them as building blocks? The other thing that's happening is that we love re-architecting all the time. So, we've had 2 decades of enterprise architecture in software, and we liked building unreliable software on reliable hardware and pushing all the complexity into the infrastructure layer. And now we're saying, no, we're going to decouple from the hardware, and we're going to have the application taking control of its own availability and its own data resilience and so on and so forth. And we're sort of breaking things up so we can scale our applications and scale our teams more effectively with microservices. So we're starting to see the application as a kind of unit of currency which we can work with more effectively, and it's decoupled away from the underlying infrastructure. So Amazon have got really good at playing this Lockin game, and they also got quite brazen. So Andy Jassy has even been quoted on stage as saying, yeah, customers kind of want the option of moving between clouds, but they try it and then they just sort of give up. So they've become quite brazen about that. I went and looked at what the analysts had to say about the changing marketplace in cloud, and what I found was the Gartner Magic Quadrant, obviously. And what I did was I put 3 consecutive years of the Magic Quadrant on one slide so you could see them. And what you observe about this is that the far bottom left-hand corner of this diagram is a shrinking island, effectively. So all the competitors have become niche, and they are falling out of the market completely in some cases. And the only providers that aren't moving backwards are Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. So that's quite interesting. You can see that the market's becoming completely polarized, and it's only really 3 players left that are actually moving anywhere. And Microsoft are even gaining a bit on Amazon from the perspective of Gartner. But that isn't the most striking thing about the latest Magic Quadrant. So if you dig inside it, what you find is that they're describing Azure as good enough alternative to AWS. You use the word good enough when you're describing a commodity market. When you can compare things on decisions other than technical capabilities, then really you've got a situation where you're heading towards a commodity market. So what does this mean? Right, the world is changing around us. We've got a commodity market evolving in cloud, and everybody wants to not be using Amazon because they think it's a really bad idea. And we've got black swan events that will hit us in the future. This is where an open source comes into the picture, and this is where BOSH becomes really, really valuable if you're running a business and you need to operate software platforms. So BOSH is the underlying part of Cloud Foundry that actually helps it deliver the platform that sits on top. It's the mechanism that allows the interface between what you saw earlier and the underlying infrastructure. And I'll come on to that in a minute. Cloud Foundry, the foundation around Cloud Foundry have something called the Cloud Foundry Certified Program, which means that when you deploy an app to one Cloud Foundry, if you're going to send it to another vendor that wants to put the word Cloud Foundry on their product, they have to be compliant with this standard. So you know that when you push an app here, it's going to work exactly the same way over there. So that's helping you manage your lock-in. Then finally, you've got the Cloud Foundry Foundation that owns the assets to the source code, and it's legally impossible for that source code to ever be transferred to a commercial entity because of the status of the Cloud Foundry Foundation as a trade organization. So you've got this sort of this collection of things which are protecting your portability and your multi-cloud, your switching costs from escalating too much. So as you saw earlier, you got the Cloud Foundry experience where you can CF push, and you can do that in the same place wherever you go, and it works in exactly the same way. But of course, in this talk, what we're talking about is BOSH. So BOSH is the magical distributed system that allows you to effectively have what's a travel adapter for cloud. So you have this thing called a CPI, and a CPI is the component of BOSH that you will change depending on what infrastructure you want to talk to underneath. It looks a bit like this. So these are some of the common CPIs that are in use. And as you can see, there's quite a good selection there of the public clouds and also the, some of the private infrastructure vendors as well. And this is just a selection of some of the ones that I know that are in production today, but there's also other ones. You can even have BOSH deploying to bare metal. So there's other options available as well. Now, I did promise that I was going to point you in a direction somewhere you can learn about the technology. There's a pivot called Maria who worked on the BOSH team who did an incredibly useful tutorial which was based on something called BOSH Light. So you can download this to your workstation exactly the same way as PCF Dev, and it takes you through the basics of learning what a deployment is, how to write a manifest, and how you can actually begin to debug things. So BOSH basically consists of something called a director. You give the director a manifest and you give it a release. So manifest is a description of what you want to create, and the releases that you put into that manifest and you put into the director are the actual software packages and a known good state of software which you can then deploy onto virtual infrastructure. So who's paying attention to this capability? So some of the early Cloud Foundry adopters have been governments and banks, and that's been quite striking actually. Two of the main verticals. So the British government, Australian government, US government, all using Cloud Foundry, and some pretty massive banks as well. And the reason is because the stakes are so high that they can't actually afford not to manage their switching costs. They have to have the ability to have that portability. The best example I've seen of an organization using this capability has been our friends at Anynines. So they were one of the public Cloud Foundry vendors that was mentioned earlier. So they've actually done this twice. They moved from VMware to OpenStack. They have a production PaaS that they make money from. They've moved it from VMware to OpenStack. They did it in 2 weeks with only 30 minutes downtime. And from the user's perspective, everything stayed exactly the same. There was no change in their service. They just moved it between different infrastructure vendors. They then did exactly the same thing again when they moved from OpenStack to AWS because they were having hardware issues on OpenStack. So this is being done. This capability is being used in the real world. It's a really good time to start using BOSH because it's getting better and better all the time. So there's been common complaints over the years about how unwieldy the YAML is, and it's really hard to get to grips with BOSH, and there's all this confusion around where the networking is done, and a lot of things are being moved out of that manifest and moved into other parts of the system. So it's actually becoming easier and easier to get started with BOSH and deploy it. And the CPIs that I mentioned earlier are getting better and better. So there was a big announcement about Pivotal and Google Cloud Platform recently, and there's been a lot of work on the Azure CPI as well. So it's historically AWS CPI has been the most heavily used, but you'll find that these other ones are now going to be more increasingly tested as well. So let's go back to this loop then. So this decision loop around Lockin. What we have is a situation where you can actually, when you come round to make that brand selection, you'll be able to select from a variety of vendors because you'll be in possession of BOSH, and you can manage that lock-in cycle much more effectively. So the key message really is that you can, and you should be doing this, you should be managing your switching costs in exactly the same way that you manage your technical debt. You just need to be conscious of it, and you need to make the right decisions. The team that I'm working in at the moment, that at various points when we've been working on stories, we've had to decide whether we'd use a native tool set in AWS or whether we would do something else. And whenever somebody raises the question, is there a BOSH release for that? I know that we're kind of unconsciously managing our switching costs because a large part of what we're trying to do is make things portable for our customer. So that's really important for us. So in summary, open source is winning because you have this capability that you didn't have before, and we are seeing a huge growth in open source technology being used all over the place in cloud. We've got portability for devs because we've got CF, and we know we've got the assurance that will work anywhere because of the CF certification. We've got portability for ops because of BOSH, and we have a situation where the marginal cost of getting good at using BOSH is coming down. So you're having to invest less of your time and effort in deploying BOSH, but the benefit of doing that, the marginal benefit, is going up because you've got a commodity market and you can take advantage of these other clouds that are getting more competitive with AWS. So that's it. As I said, I did that talk at the CF Summit in Frankfurt, and I've sort of shortened it for tonight to try and tailor it for beginners audience. Is there any questions? No. Excellent. I can have a beer. Oh, you've got one.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the migration. Is it a big bang migration, or did they do it in phases, or one example that you gave?
Sure. So there's two challenges to migration. One is you could do everything behind the scenes, but then you've got the DNS switch for your users. The other massive problem, well, not massive problem, but something you really have to think about is the data, if you're migrating data between places, because you've got consistency issues there. But it's always state that's the problem. It's not really setting up the infrastructure. But BOSH does help you manage state in a very intelligent way, so that's worth looking at. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you think that the Lockin at the level of platform is that as much of a concern as at the infrastructure level? Do you get that question? When somebody chooses platform, do they have the question of how to change?
No, I haven't. So the question is vendor lock-in at the platform level as much as an issue as at the infrastructure level? So I haven't had that question posed before. I suppose the answer is that Cloud Foundry doesn't really require you to change that much about your code base, other than it being an application that's kind of more optimized for the 12-factor type principles. There's not a lot you have to do other than understand a bit about manifests potentially and environment variables and stuff to make it work. So there's nothing that really ties you to Cloud Foundry. It just gives you that awesome experience. Any other questions? Yes? Have I done that? No. Oh, has BOSH ever done that? I'm not aware of any examples. It can. Sorry, the question is, has BOSH ever been used to move Hadoop infrastructure? I believe, Colin, have you ever used it to deploy Hadoop?
I have used it to deploy Hadoop, I haven't used it to move Hadoop.
Right. Yes, so again, that would be a state issue, but it certainly is possible to use it to deploy Hadoop in exactly the same way as you would deploy everything else. Any other questions? And I'll try and remember to repeat them this time. Okay, so I think you're entitled to a break.